every man a king.
Huey Long may have promised every man a king, but it was clear enough who wore the crown.
With every man a king. What do you think about that? I think it's fine.
Soon, Huey would become a familiar voice to listeners around the country.
We didn't have television in those days, and radio was very prominent. Huey Long would come on radio and he'd say, "Now this is Huey Long, and I'm going to play some music, and I want you to get on the telephone and call your friends and tell them that I'm on. And I'm going to give you about 10 or 15 minutes to do that." And you'd be amazed at the number of people, my dad included, that would immediately get up and get on the telephone and start calling his friends, and other people would call their friends to tell them to get on to turn on the radio and listen to Huey Long.
Huey Long was poised to spread his message well beyond the borders of Louisiana and appeal to Americans everywhere. The message was now, share our wealth.
We expect to see the 48 states of America and the United States fall in line with Louisiana's Share Our Wealth program. That will mean that there'll be no such thing as a man without a home and something to eat and something to wear and a job. If you allow a big man to have billions, then all of us can't have anything else. So we propose that none shall be bigger than a 10 millionaire, and none shall own less than a home and the comforts necessary for a home, and property to educate their children.
The entire federal government would run on the basis of these confiscations from millionaires. There wasn't nearly enough money in the country to do that. Huey Long was playing a shell game. Whether he believed it or not, if he did believe it, he was awfully naive. If he didn't believe it, he was a charlatan.
Huey quickly lost patience with President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. His call for change was capturing the attention of voters around the country and worrying the White House.
Either one of them, and it was got to have a candidate away from the Republican Party and away from the Democratic Party. I, for one, am perfectly willing to see that there's another choice in the United States in 1936.
I personally believe that Huey ushered in a lot of these reforms, not only for Louisiana, but for the nation. We're talking about minimum wage. We're talking about the 40-hour week. But he pressured Roosevelt to do those things.
Back home in Louisiana, he continued to crush anyone who opposed him. One of the enemies punished by Long was Judge Benjamin Pavey of St. Landry Parish. His son-in-law was Dr. Carl Weiss. On a muggy night in September 1935, Weiss came to the state capitol and confronted the senator. Exactly what happened next remains in doubt even to this day.
In those days, you got the news by an extra, and I remember hearing this boy holler, "Extra, extra, extra, Huey Long's been shot."
According to the conventional theories, Dr. Carl Weiss shot Long. The senator's bodyguards then drew their weapons and gunned down his attacker, riddling Weiss's body with more than 50 bullet holes. But there's also good reason to doubt that version of events.
Much of the evidence in the assassination, such as the bullets, have disappeared. Huey Long's clothing that he wore has disappeared. There's a great deal of controversy and question as to whether Dr. Weiss did it all by himself or whether there was a conspiracy and whether the bodyguards struck Huey Long.
But while Huey's death came as a shock to the nation, it was hardly a surprise.
Anytime you'd be discussing politics, invariably somebody would say, somebody needs to wipe him out, somebody needs to get rid of him, he's just a dictator, somebody's got to do something. But really, I heard that more than once.
In a great measure, Huey Long shot Huey Long, because Huey Long, with his vindictiveness, he engendered a climate of hostility that caused this state to be an armed camp.
For all those who may have hated Huey Long, however, there were a great many more among the poor and dispossessed who regarded him as a hero.
Never in its history has the South seen such crowds. More than 80,000 filed solemnly past his bier, many visibly affected.
When you understand that he was elected to the United States Senate in 1930. He took his seat in 1932. He was killed in 1935. He had 3 years, essentially, in the national arena. And during that 3 years, he became one of the most photographed, one of the most discussed people in the country.
While the Great Depression had stupefied much of the United States, the effects in Louisiana seemed much less severe, if only because the state had been so poor to begin with. Because of the fierce rivalry between Huey Long and President Roosevelt, relief from New Deal programs was slow to come to Louisiana.
When Huey Long was assassinated, and then the next year, Dick Lesch elected governor of Louisiana, Lesch had no quarrel with the New Deal, and therefore he made his peace with Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt pumped millions of dollars of federal money into Louisiana. For example, he used PWA money to build the new charity hospital in New Orleans. Therefore, the state benefited a great deal from the New Deal programs under Lesch.
However, it wasn't his buildings and bridges that earned Governor Lesch headlines around the country. In 1939, journalists began investigating deep-rooted corruption in the governor's office and throughout the remnants of the Long political machine. What they uncovered was startling.
The scandals of 1939 were of such a magnitude that it would be difficult to even imagine anything like that happening right now. The net result was when the governor went to prison, the president of the state's flagship university went to prison. The head of the Louisiana State Medical Society went to prison. People killed themselves, they committed suicide. It's important to remember, though, that this was not Huey's doing. This was his legacy to these people who didn't know how to handle it.
Following the disgrace and humiliation of those scandals, voters experimented briefly with political reform. They ushered into the governor's mansion men like Sam Jones, who worked to clean up much of the corruption. In 1944, country music and movie star Jimmy Davis led the anti-Long ticket. As governor, Davis may not have done much to improve Louisiana's lagging economy, but at least he made people feel better.
Hey, he sang "You Are My Sunshine." He was popular. He was pleasant to everybody. He was polite. People liked him.
When skies are gray.
What finally spurred Louisiana's economy was the advent of World War II. The state became a crucial location for the United States military as the nation readied for battle.
0 hour in Louisiana, the greatest field exercise in American military history, with over 40,000 motorized vehicles and 500,000 men.
Louisiana was the site of many training camps and of the 1940 Louisiana maneuvers, which were the biggest maneuvers ever held by the United States Army.
2,000 officer referees keep score as the Army puts the accent on tank warfare and anti-tank defense.
George Patton was a part of those maneuvers. Dwight Eisenhower made his reputation in the Louisiana maneuvers.
There were 400,000 people involved in maneuvers. There were just an awful lot of soldiers in Louisiana, primarily in the central Louisiana. It ended the Depression for central Louisiana. The city of Pineville went from 26,000 in 1940 to 58,000 in 1950.
During the maneuvers in 1940 and 1941, mock battles were carried out over some 30,000 square miles of Louisiana soil. Before the end of the war, more than 1 million servicemen would receive their training at Fort Polk near Leesville.
Louisiana made its contribution and then some to the Second World War, both in food, of course, and cotton. And it was a place where German POWs captured in North Africa were sent. and put to work, mainly in the cane fields, which the Germans hated.
Once the war began, Louisiana and her coastline actually became the scene of battle.
It was German submarines who came over in January and February, got across the Atlantic and got down into the Gulf of Mexico, and then right off the Louisiana coast began sinking oil tankers on their way up to the factories in the Northeast. So these submarines could come up at night, look through the periscope, and there would be a ship silhouetted against the sky by the lights on land. And boom! And they'd let them have it. The Germans called it the happy hunting ground.
On shore in New Orleans, thousands of workers were constructing a unique amphibious landing craft for a man named Andrew Higgins.
He was designing flat-bottom boats for the oil companies, which were then exploring in the bayous of Louisiana. And he built this boat that later became known as the Higgins boat. A little more than 30 feet long with a flat bottom that could turn around in its own length. And he could put a ramp on it that could drop down so that a whole platoon of men, 30 men, could get off immediately and start firing right away. Every American soldier who went ashore in an invasion in World War II did so in a boat built in New Orleans at Higgins Industries. If Andy Higgins had not designed and then built those landing craft, we never could have gone in over an open beach. The whole strategy of the war would have been different. Adolf Hitler called Andy Higgins the new Noah.
Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied forces in Europe, called him the man who won the war. Louisiana gave the nation inspiring war heroes. Some are well known, such as General Claire Chennault from Tensas Parish, whose air squadron was the celebrated Flying Tigers. There were many others too, not so renowned to history, who helped win the war.
Louisiana also contributed more than its fair share of soldiers to the war effort. Men who joined up more volunteered out of Louisiana in proportion to the population than from any other state.
When I got to the beach, I found that the traffic control officer, who was a colonel, had become a casualty, and so I then was put in the position as a 23-year-old Army captain of being the traffic control officer for Omaha Beach.
Less than a year after the Allies landed on the beaches of Normandy, the war in Europe was won. Victory over Japan would soon follow.
No one forgets VJ Day. In New Orleans, the strippers came out of the bar on Bourbon Street. They came into the traffic on Canal and took all their clothes off. The whole country went crazy.
When the war ended and soldiers returned, they found that Louisiana was becoming a very different place than the one they had left. All along the Mississippi River, between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, petrochemical plants were constructed or expanded. Oil production in the state jumped from 100 million barrels per year in 1940 to double that amount by the end of the decade. And the Standard Oil refinery in Baton Rouge came to employ 10,000 workers.
Electricity came to homes in Louisiana during the 1940s, many homes that had never had it before. Louisiana was urbanized. Cities like Monroe, Shreveport, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, Alexandria grew rapidly. And there were many, many changes.
Families were now seeing more of their sons and daughters going to college than ever before. Huey Long's devotion to Louisiana State University had boosted the school's stature and attracted nationally renowned intellectuals. The university was home to the seminal literary movements, represented in the Southern Review, and to writers like Cleonth Brooks and Robert Penn Warren.
They were vigorous, creative minds, eager to get on with the study of literature, get on with the new way to approach literature.
Warren's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, All the King's Men, was inspired by his observation of Huey Long.
He was writing that book during World War II, and he often said himself he had as much Mussolini in mind, as he did Huey Long, that it was the question of the way that power was grasped, how it was exerted, how it came to affect people for the good and the bad. So he's looking at a political issue about leadership immediately after, the book comes out immediately after World War II, at a time when the whole issue of what kind of leadership, what kind of government can the free world maintain.
Penn Warren is just one of the greatest writers who ever lived, and he did it all. He wrote essays, criticism, plays. He was an educator, a member of the fugitive movement. He was a great novelist, a Pulitzer Prize winner. He was a magnificent poet. There was nothing he did not achieve.
Outside of LSU, the vibrant literary climate of Louisiana continued to foster native talent and to lure flourishing new writers. It was during this period that playwright Tennessee Williams settled in the French Quarter and peopled the American stage with slow, smoldering characters like Blanche Dubois and Stella Kowalski.
He was just a marvelous writer, and certainly for actors, and for women. He understood women, I think, more so than most playwrights. He knew how to bring it out. Lovely sense of poetry in all of his writing, I must say. So rich for the exploration of the characters. It was rich, and I miss him a great deal.
In the 1940s, we see a sort of high mark for Louisiana presence in the national consciousness. Tennessee Williams' Streetcar Named Desire premiered. Lillian Hellman's All the Little Foxes, and then Another Part of the Forest, Toys in the Attic, all these Louisiana plays on Broadway. It was an extraordinary time for Louisiana and New Orleans to be in the national imagination.
Louisiana was even starting to sound different. Just as this had been the cradle of jazz a generation earlier, Louisiana continued to be a place of tremendous musical innovation. Hughie Ledbetter, better known as Leadbelly, popularized songs like Goodnight Irene, Midnight Special, and Pickin' Cotton. Although he grew up in Shreveport, he was more often associated with another part of Louisiana, Angola.
Leadbelly is a mythic figure in American culture broadly, and not just Louisiana culture. It comes from the fact that he touched a number of different kinds of audiences. Then he had the situation that he was imprisoned a couple of different times for murder, and found himself in a couple of different times singing his way out of prison, or at least getting the attention of the warden.
Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I guess Jane my dream.
In New Orleans, rhythm and blues and rock and roll were fast replacing jazz as the city's favorite music.
Found my thrill.
Fats Domino, Lloyd Price, Smiley Lewis, and then you begin to get more of a pop sound with people like Alan Toussaint coming in and adding to it. In North Louisiana, of course, Jerry Lee Lewis. Just like Fats is the Buddha-like, smiling, genteel Creole gentleman of New Orleans with sweetness in all directions. Jerry Lee's the sort of snarling hellfire killer man of the North.
I changed my mind. This love is fine. For goodness gracious, great balls of fire.
Great balls of fire. In one expression, that's kind of like the Holy Spirit meets sexuality, all in one line.